Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very honored today to share with you the spirit of accomplishment and promise that comes with the inauguration of the academic convocation as an integral part of our educational enterprise. I think it is a truism that one of the most important roles of a university faculty involves a serious obligation to encourage and support the constant search for information and enlightenment. And it's to this end that members of this faculty have provided the leadership and given direction to the initiation of this convocation. They have demonstrated a sense of academic responsibility and consistently good judgment in identifying conspicuously articulate men and women of intellectual stature who might be invited to address the citizens of our campus and community. I am confident that this day will come to be an historic landmark in the academic growth and maturity of our university. I am equally confident that this convocation and those to follow will serve our university, its faculty, and its students well. It's my further pleasure at this time to make some introductions. First, I should like to introduce President Emeritus William Hanson. And the Chairman of the Faculty Senate and Chairman of the Department of History, Dr. Justice Paul. There are those who would doubt that the university as an institution will survive the 20th century. They see it as the last of the medieval institutions left intact, and one that is destined to go the way of knighthood, and the monasteries, and the shires, all of which I believe disappeared somewhere between the 16th and 18th centuries. This belief stems from the observation that the man of letters, the Chaucerian scholar, the professor of classical philosophy, no longer walks tall on any campus. Instead, there are those who see the rise of the robber baron professor, for whom the ultimate recognition is to have his academic excellence rewarded by being relieved of teaching responsibilities and assigned to some well-financed applied project that has little or nothing to do with the transmission of knowledge from professor to student. I can say only this: that is not true of our campus, where the outstanding teacher is recognized for its consummate ability to teach and is typified by the current, and may I say frequent, recipient of the Outstanding Teacher Award, Professor Pat Crow.
Chancellor Ellery, Mr. Buckley, President Hanson, Mr. Paul, with whom I work closely. I'm very happy to receive the Excellence in Teaching Award. I probably don't deserve it, but I accept it simply as a symbol of the good teaching that is done here by many. More than anything else, it should be a reminder that good teaching goes on throughout the university. There are many excellent and dedicated teachers. In my mind, the award belongs to all of these people. I want to say a few words about the academic community, where hopefully we are all learners and all teachers. And I think one of the things we do have to learn is that we are all part of humanity, students, teachers, public alike. Teaching and learning involve the human transmission of something concrete, knowledge. Teachers must be eager to give of what they know. Students must realize they are here not to attain 120 plus 4 credits alone. And sometimes I think we view education as this opportunity or this need to jump over a number of little hurdles of classes and credits, and when we, in the end, receive the diploma, that's it. We're not here for this purpose, but to attain knowledge. This is the focus of education. Both faculty and student bodies should be intellectually and emotionally committed to this end. A teacher must indeed be a philosopher in terms of the classic definition, a lover of knowledge. And this is, of course, what the philosophy and the term philosopher meant in the olden days. You may recall I used the phrase human transmission of knowledge. Whether we are speaking of the great store of learning accumulated in writing stored in libraries and archives, or if we refer to the splinters of information transmitted orally from teacher to student or vice versa, we are referring to human knowledge. The success of education depends on our ability to transmit this priceless information from one to another. This is in part a matter of communication. We must learn to write and to speak clearly and with accuracy. And I think one of the tributes we must pay to Mr. Buckley is that he is a prime example of having mastered the arts of communication. It is in part an intellectual matter. We must understand what we are communicating, but it is also in part emotional. We must be eager to give of whatever we may know to others. Just as we all must love knowledge, so we must also love people with whom we are associated with in the academic community. and this is a part of teaching. I read recently that a friend of the French Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro said that he was so great a teacher that he could teach stones to draw correctly. It's a tremendous compliment, but in terms of a literal transmission of this, forget it. It just isn't so. We transmit this knowledge to people. Here then we have what I believe is the heart of academia, the university, people working together with people in a spirit of love for each other and for learning, working together for the elusive goals of knowledge and truth. A common saying that we have all probably heard at times is that we must teach children not subject matter. But it seems to me we must teach people that body of material which is valid and meaningful. If we work together to do this energetically and sincerely, surely some measure of success will be ours. Thank you.
In introducing our convocation speaker, I must say that it seems presumptuous for me to even suggest that a man who is recognized internationally as an author, editor, lecturer, television host requires any introduction on a university campus. Nevertheless, there are some aspects of his wide-ranging career that seem to deserve particular mention on this occasion. A graduate of Yale with honors in political science, economics, and history, our guest has served as university instructor and lecturer, is the recipient of honorary doctoral degrees from 15 universities, including Seton Hall, Niagara, St. Bonaventure, Farley Dickinson, Alfred, Notre Dame. He received the University of Southern California Distinguished Achievement Award in Journalism, a television Emmy for Outstanding Program Achievement, Best Columnist of the Year Award, and other forms of recognition for his numerous books and articles, including his contributions to the Atlantic, Harper's, McCall's, the New Yorker, and of course the National Review, of which he is both founder and editor. His syndicated column appears in over 300 newspapers. His weekly television show, Firing Line, is carried by the Public Broadcasting Service as well as commercial stations across the nation. I am indeed pleased that with his heavy schedule, he could still find time to be with us today, and it is with appreciation as well as pleasure that I introduce William F. Buckley, Jr.
Dr. Ellery, ladies and gentlemen of the University of Wisconsin, thank you for your hospitality. Thank you, Dr. Ellery, for your kind introduction. You will all, I know, be relieved that I have not accomplished more in my lifetime. Conservatives are more at home fulfilling traditions than innovating them. I asked innocently last night how long convocation speakers traditionally orated, and was told there never had been any convocation speakers. Any number of traditions appear to be in the making in Wisconsin this year. I have been informally approached in anticipation of a possible vacancy in the Chancellor's office later on. The thought struck me surrealistically that perhaps I should speak from now until Election Day non-stop. But of course that is the prerogative of the Chancellor. and I would not want to get in his way. Besides, it's hot. And the silence of Camp David is terribly noisy. Accordingly, I propose to share with you, while wishing you a happy and productive academic year, a few thoughts mostly somber that have preoccupied me in recent seasons, which I have elected this morning, with your permission, to put forward in the form of propositions. The first proposition is that the freedom to deceive is overindulged. In our age, the freedom of expression has brought, have you noticed, a virtual immunity to those who deceive. And foremost among those who do so as a class are, of course, the politicians. But in a society in which there is also freedom to criticize, the politicians would probably not get away with it as frequently as they do, except for the indulgence of the only class of citizens professionally trained to isolate untruth and shoot it bang, bang right down to earth. I mean, of course, the academicians. I don't seek to codify this proposition by giving it constitutional lineaments. The Stevens Point Manifesto. But I do propose that we meditate more seriously than we have done the continuing civil consequences of the extraordinary immunity of the advocates of utopianism from the bar of critical opinion. In pursuit of superstition, they pipe us down the road to serfdom while making the music of abundance and justice and joy. It is perhaps the most frequently summoned jape at the expense of representative democracy to recall the story of the earnest legislator who sought one day in the mid-30s to lighten the load of the school children of Indiana by introducing a bill that would trim the value of pi from 3.1416 to the more manageable figure of 3. Where are the forces that drowned him in derision when, mutatis mutandis, Senator Kennedy gives a speech about free health? I'm here with you for only a few hours, leaving in a few minutes to return to the nervous center of the cultural world, to a city groaning under the weight of the greatest density of intellectuals per acre this side of Plato's Academy. But I have not heard it asserted there by more than 2 New Yorkers, and one of them lost his job in the Senate for having said it, that no respectable canon of redistributive justice recognizes any duty on the part of residents of Detroit or Birmingham or Key West or even Palo Alto to subsidize the cost of rapid transit in New York City. Self-respect requires that we stimulate social and academic sanctions against that which is misleading, let alone preposterous. But Ralph Nader, the only social hero of our time, is obsessed by how many cornflakes are missing from the package sold at the grocery store, while undisturbed by how many middles are undistributed in the speech of the typical politician of the left. As the intellectual and historical case against formal socialism strengthens, the threat of socialist forms become paradoxically greater. If freedom requires an alert class of truth watchers, but the designated class does no such thing, what then happens to freedom? How can the delinquent class be persuaded to do its duty? Proposition 2. The alleged intellectual inferiority of the class of practicing capitalists in America is less, I think, an intellectual than an ethical judgment. Professor Hayek complained 30 years ago about, quote, the inferior caliber of those intellectuals who incline in favor of the free market by comparison with those who defend socialism. But he wrote those dismaying words before the great intellectual counteroffensive of the past 20 years, for which he is himself substantially responsible, which has left socialist dogma in disarray. Professor John Kenneth Galbraith, giving an interview last January to a journalist in London, said that he was forced to admit it, that whereas 15 years ago he and his colleagues at Harvard were pretty well convinced that there were no serious problems left unanswered in economics, now he recognizes how much there is left to discover. If there is so much left for other economists to discover, a fortiori we can imagine how much there is left for Professor Galbraith to discover. But to be opinionated is, of course, a part of Professor Galbraith's endearing style. I was recently with him at lunch, attempting to find a common blank in our calendars in order to schedule a network exchange for which we had contracted. I proposed to him the first week in November, but he replied, studying his engagement book, that that would not do, that during the first week in November he would be lecturing at the University of Moscow. Oh, I said, what do you have left to teach them? But for so long as Mr. Galbraith continues to teach economics to the Soviet Union, at least we will have a market for our excess grain. But for all his tergiversations, Mr. Galbraith has never wavered on one correct disposition, and that is his contempt for the class of American capitalists. I speak here and below of class characteristics, obviously not of the many thousands of distinguished individual members of that class. I fear that in this matter he is horribly correct. He chronicles not only the cupidity, but the parasitic habits of so many of them, the predatory nature of their belief in the marketplace. I hope you will understand me as trying to say something more interesting than that greed is the root of many evils, a bipartisan truism about human nature. It was now over 2 years ago, addressing the AFL and CIO in Washington, that Solzhenitsyn proclaimed the natural alliance of the American worker and the Russian worker in an entirely non-Marxist frame. But he added, there is another alliance, the alliance between our communist leaders and your capitalists. He went on to discuss a recent exhibit at the Soviet Union of United States anti-criminal technology that engrossed the Russians, who instantly put in orders for the whole lot, cash on the barrelhead. The problem, Solzhenitsyn pointed out, the problem being that we were selling our scientific paraphernalia not to the law-abiding for use against criminals, but to criminals for use against the law-abiding, rather like inventing the guillotine for the purpose of slaughtering cattle and then selling it to Robespierre in full knowledge of the uses to which he intended to put it. But that short-sightedness is, I think, not a natural development of capitalism, let alone an organic part of it. It is, I think, a culturally conditioned indifference to political philosophy, born of an inferiority complex about the prodigious achievements of the private sector, a stubborn moral nescience, a fugitive unconcern for the cultivation of values, only a painstaking care for which can guarantee the survival of free men. I speak of a class of self-conscious men benumbed by 2 generations of contempt heaped upon them by academicians and moralists and politicians, which class reacts now in strange, intimidated ways, exhibiting a libertine indifference to the direction of political economic instruction, even in the schools they patronize, to which they send their sons and daughters, in some cases for impacted indoctrination in the evils of the society they sustain or are sustained by. Of a class which, while neglecting the work of serious students of freedom, neglecting their journals of opinion, sustains, indeed causes to flourish through gaudy advertising, the trendy journals that combine in resolutely fixed ratio licentious assaults on delicately nurtured restraints on biological appetite with fundamentalist condemnations of American institutions and policies. Screw magazine interviewing Mrs. Allende, paid for by General Motors. The American capitalist, whose image crystallizes in the mind of so many of the young, isn't even the smug, canny, willful power broker of Upton Sinclair. He is, in the image of many of you, the inarticulate, self-conscious, bumbling mechanic of the private sector, struck dumb by the least cliche of socialism, fleeing into the protective arms of government at the least hint of commercial difficulty, delighting secretly in the convenient power of the huge labor union to negotiate for an entire industry, uniformly successful only in his escapist ambition to grow duller and duller as the years go by, eyes left beseeching favor from the public moralists. I remember on one occasion sitting in the Oval Room with President Nixon. No doubt the taped conversation survives. When the name of Ronald Reagan came up, I said, one of the reasons why I admire Ronald Reagan is that he is the only man I have ever met who really and truly doesn't care what the New York Times thinks of him. The president reacted sharply by bouncing from his chair and pointing at the Attorney General. Well, I don't care either, do I, John? Tell him I don't care, John. Tell him. Poor Ayn Rand, who sought to give the American capitalist a massive dose of testosterone to make him virile and irresistible, leader of a triumphant meritocratic revolt against asphyxiative government. But soon it transpired, even as Professor Russell Kirk had predicted in reviewing her novel in the Christian Science Monitor, that it was being read widely not because of its jack-booted individualism, but because of the fornicating bits. The entrepreneurial class in America can only change its image by taking a lusty joy from its achievements, and by seeing human freedom whole or not at all, as springing season after season from a trampoline of assumptions which are the warp and woof of freedom and progress. I shall not soon forget the scene, symbolic of the triumphs of demagogic terror over productive enterprise that continues to this hour. Senator Scoop Jackson, sitting high in his committee chair, addressing the 12 top officials of the oil and gas industry, meekly astride their stools at the bar of justice, publicly chastising them on their obscene profits. How bracing it would have been if, as one man, they had risen to their feet early in the tirade and walked out, leaving the senator lecturing only to the television cameras, which of course he was primarily addressing. Cecil B. DeMille gave up $1 million contract because he refused to pay the sum of $1 to a labor union who insisted on a closed shop. Cecil B. DeMille is dead. And all the mighty work of Hayek and Mises and Friedman have not bred his replacement. Proposition 3, the use of humanitarian cliches should be regulated. I was asked the other day during a question period by a bright student, don't you think it's wrong to make a profit from human misery? The context of the question was a discussion of socialized medicine, and I suggested we examine the implications of the generality. Undertakers profit from human misery if what you mean by profit is that an undertaker charges more to remove a corpse, embalm it, place it in a casket, display it in a mourning room, and inter it in the designated plot of ground than it would cost him to attend to these functions. At the end of what Pete Morwick and Mitchell might call a good week, the undertaker is wealthier than he was at the beginning of the week in rough proportion as he came into profitable contact with human misery. Do we deduce that we need socialized morticians? GS-15s with GS-18s confirmed by the Senate? Assuming that the answer is in the affirmative, how have we actually got away from profit? If the undertaker works for the government, all that has changed is that he does not profit at the per corpse level. That is to say, his salary is constant. But of course, his salary outruns the expenses he incurs in discharging the regulations imposed by the government, else he would not be able to eat and drink at night and buy clothes for his wife and toys for his children. The residual difference is, of course, that there would be fewer varieties of undertaking services to choose from, even as we are stuck with a single foreign policy. But why stop? Although some people eat to appease gluttony, most do so to frustrate hunger. To be hungry is to be miserable. Does it follow that the tiller of the soil, or the hog butcher, or the cereal packager is a profiteer of human misery and should be nationalized, along with the house builders who frustrate the misery of exposure by insulating us with wood and brick, and the furnace makers who frustrate the misery of cold by keeping us warm? Isn't it safe to say that if you owned the Mona Lisa and someone took it from you, misery would result? Let's therefore agree that misery is too broad a term to use in the formulation of such a social ethic as we have been exploring, and ask whether the questioner used the term profit with greater precision. Surely not, as we have seen, inasmuch as everyone earns a profit objectively defined who practices any given activity in preference to inactivity. A profit, when it crops up in such formulations as we are discussing, is normally used invidiously. It is intended to convey a usurious exaction on a suffering victim or public. It was filmed in chiaroscuro in The Third Man, where Orson Welles, you will remember, profited from human misery by cornering the market on penicillin and selling it at such prices as one might expect to get from the sale of life preservers the last night out on the Titanic. An undiscriminating public tended to lose sight of the storyline after the curtain went down on the gratifyingly mangled corpse of Orson Welles. That public tended to identify the villainy not with the man who had cornered the market, but with the manufacturer of the drug. It is no safer, I think, to say that the drug industry is composed of better men than average than it is to say that the Supreme Court is composed of better men than average. I have in my lifetime met too few capitalists who are unwilling to use the government when the use of the government is economically convenient. But the drug industry, whatever the purity of its spokesman, is easily victimized by the demagogue who finds it easier to denounce the incremental cost of a capsule over against the cost charged to the consumer. As well compare the ergs of physical energy expended by a young man digging a ditch against those of an eye surgeon removing a cataract, and reason that the former should be paid more per hour than the latter. It is a complicated business, sorting out the incursions of the moralists against the practices of the free marketplace. On one drug they are almost all addicted. It is ignorance. And if there were a cure for it, one might for once adjourn one's objections to socializing its manufacture and requiring everyone to ingest it under pain of law. And my final proposition: we are quickly losing sight of the case for human freedom, and particularly of the relevance of the marketplace. I was not long ago at a symposium with Professor Galbraith and Jean-Francois Revel, author of the then famous book, A Future Without Marx or Jesus. Parenthetically, I can understand a future without Marx, but had always supposed that if our future is to be without Jesus, the decision would probably be his, not ours. In any case, I have no doubt that the great religious revival in America will come only after Jack Anderson reveals that, in fact, on the third day, Christ arose. Mr. Revel joined Mr. Galbraith in deploring economic assumptions in America. He noted that the bicentennial of our revolution just passed suggested the need for a new revolution, animated this time by the conviction that under capitalism, quotes, man became the tool of his tools, and that he must once more become an end and a value in himself. I remember it was only 10 years ago, the analysis that touched on the quick of the problem, done by a stylish young intellectual who put it this way to the audience. Once upon a time, he said, heroism was thought to be worth risking, and even death, for two reasons. The first, that heroism was rewarded in another world. The second, that heroism is rewarded in the memory of man who built the foundations of freedom upon the sacrifices of others. But now, he explained, now that we all know from the scientific evidence that there is in fact no other world, no transcendent experience, now that we have invented weapons capable of destroying all of mankind and therefore all of human memory along with it, what is the reason left for heroism, for war, or even for the risk of war, he asked. It seemed to me then, and seems to me now, that finding oneself in such a polemical corner, one had traditionally only to reach into one's arsenal, as Patrick Henry once did. Pull out the arrow that has freedom written on it and touch it down on the skeptic, and he would waste away like a witch come into contact with water. You will have noticed, some of you, that it doesn't work anymore, because freedom, as far as much of the public is aware, is a condition describable only by subjective criteria. Professor Ross Terrell of Harvard, author of the two most influential articles that have appeared in our time on the subject of mainland China, articles that were greedily read by the President of the United States and all the press who accompanied him to China in 1972. Terrell is to be distinguished from the famous apologists for Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany, who made their way for years by simply denying the crimes imputed to Stalin during the 30s and 40s. Terrell denies nothing. He doesn't disguise the conditions of life in China today, not for a minute. After informing us that in China there is no freedom to practice religion, nor to vote, nor to express oneself freely, nor to read books or periodicals one desires to read, nor to join a labor union, nor to change one's job, nor to travel to another city or another country, he asks ingenuously, quote, "People ask me, is China free?" He answers with great difficulty. It depends what you mean by freedom, he says. Freedom is always defined with reference to the limitations of the relevant entity. In the United States, it happens to be the individual. In China, it happens to be the whole state. And he illustrates, consider the writer Kuo Mojo, the late Kuo Mojo. In the 30s, Kuo Mojo wrote books he wanted to write for a mere 4, 5, at most 8,000 people. Now, he was required by the state to write books that would appeal to 20 or 30 or 50 million people. Is that wrong, the Harvard professor asks. Then there is the researcher at Peking University whose affinity has been for abstract science, for pure research, but who was recently directed to concentrate all of his time on pest control. Is that wrong? Terrell asks once again. And I think we begin to understand the phenomenon, the ideological egalitarianism that rushes in after practical diplomacy, such that Richard Nixon, who went to China to establish a dialogue with Mao Zedong, ended by likening Mao's revolution to George Washington's, ended by proclaiming that we would have a long march together, as if to say that Mao, too, is entitled to his Via Dolorosa. Why should we not ecumenically share our own with him? Where is Vatican III? And there was Mr. Nixon seated next to Madame Mao Zedong, watching resignedly in the little chamber deep in Peking ballet presented as anti-capitalist agitprop, a violation not only of art but of manners. It was as if we had invited the presidents of the black African republics to the White House, there to show them a ballet on the theme of Little Black Sambo. And Mr. Nixon, returning to the United States, proclaiming at Andrews Air Force Base the great enthusiasm the Chinese people feel for their governors. Indeed, the Chinese had done much to illustrate ways of generating enthusiasm for their government, and no doubt Mr. Nixon was professionally fascinated by them. But we saw through him the movement of Western opinion adrift from its philosophical moorings. What really is so bad about Red China? Their ways aren't our ways, to be sure. But is it seriously proposed that we should be prepared to die, if necessary, in order to avoid living by their word rather than by our own, which is in any case corrupt, racist, decadent, materialist? The ongoing search for a new American revolution that would restore meaning to the individual is up against the most conspicuous precedents of the century. Two great revolutions whose extirpative passion, however, proved to be the elimination of the individual. And indeed, have you noticed, such of the revolutionary rhetoric as silts up these days pays only formalistic attention to the individual, preferring always to appeal to the people. Indeed, metaphysical defenses of man are somehow just a little embarrassing, irrelevant. Even Whittaker Chambers, the most lyrical and ardent counter-revolutionist of my generation, would poke gentle fun of the inflexible defenders of the individual. Of his colleague, the late Mr. Frank Meyer, for instance, whose implacable book called In Defense of Freedom was current when the Republicans suffered their great congressional defeat of 1958. If the Republican Party does not find a way to appeal to the mass of the people, Chambers wrote me on that occasion, it will find itself voted into singularity. It will become then something like the little shop you see in the crowded parts of great cities in which no business is done or expected. You enter it and find an old man in the rear, fingering for his own pleasure oddments of cloth, caring not at all if he sells any. As your eyes become accustomed to the gaslight, you are only faintly surprised to discover that the old man is Frank Meyer. I submit to the critics of American society that if they are truly concerned about the survival of the individual, they must focus on him, focus on those oddments of cloth, by a familiarity with which a few men and women know to hesitate not at all when someone asks the question, is it wrong for the state to tell the writer what to write Is it wrong for the state to tell the scientist what to study? Those few who do not hesitate to answer, yes, it is wrong. It was always wrong. It is now wrong and will forever be wrong. The old man with the oddments of cloth is fingering some of the great truths that have enabled us to penetrate the sophistries by which we are sometimes persuaded that we can serve the individual by drifting away from the principal institution through which the individual asserts what freedom of movement our modern architects have left him with, or that we can make a profitable philosophical beginning by revolutionarily renouncing that religion which tells us in the words of Ecclesiastes that God has made man upright. The subject is strangely, quietly saddening as we meet here this morning and touch on the subject of the free marketplace in Russia. The people crowd to the only free market left. It is, of course, the black market, and pay there 80 rubles, a month's wages, for a single novel by Solzhenitsyn. And there in Russia, whose rulers denounced the marketplace 60 years ago with a blaze of trumpets and a rain of bullets aimed at the temples of teenage girls and a hemophiliac boy in a cellar in Central Asia, there in Russia, 60 years after the advent of socialism, there are old men and old women and young women who transcribe by hand, not for profit, from Radio Liberty, risking prison by the very act of listening to it, the latest novel of Solzhenitsyn. Word after word, sentence after sentence, page after page. A process that takes them weeks and months to complete, resulting not in thousands, let alone millions of copies, but in a few dozen or perhaps a few hundred, the oddments of cloth. But it is worth it. Worth everything to preserve those oddments, to make them available to those who are graced with a thirst for them. And so the books of Solzhenitsyn accumulate, even as the disdain for the institutions of freedom perversely accumulates, for an explanation of which paradox we find no help at all in Marx, but considerable help in Jesus, whose servant Paul observed that though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day.
Well, Mr. Buckley, we have a medallion commemorating this first annual academic convocation, and I'd like you to have it as a memento of your visit. Clearly, this, the first in what I sincerely hope will be a long tradition of academic convocations, has enjoyed a most auspicious inauguration. I thank Mr. Buckley, and I thank all of you for your participation. I wish to express particular appreciation to Professor Richard Feldman, Professor Franz Schmitz, for the leadership they have provided in the planning, preparation, and organization of this convocation. Again, my thanks to all of you. Now the annual academic convocation of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point is adjourned.